In the space of just 3 years, the most powerful empire on earth was brought to its knees by a group of farmers. 45,000 British soldiers and civilians died. The war cost Britain the equivalent of $6 billion in today's money. And when it was finally over, the British Empire had technically won, yet walked away more humiliated than almost any victor in modern military history. In the next 10 minutes, you will discover exactly how the Boer War unfolded, why Britain's overwhelming military advantage counted for almost nothing in the early stages, and what catastrophic mistakes turned what London expected to be a 6-week campaign into a 3-year nightmare. We will also examine the one element of this conflict that British history books spent decades quietly glossing over, because it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the Empire's methods of warfare. Background: to understand the Boer War, you first need to understand who the Boers were. The word Boer is simply the Dutch word for farmer. These were the descendants of Dutch, German, and French Huguenot settlers who had been living in southern Africa since the 17th century. By the 19th century, they had developed their own distinct culture, their own language called Afrikaans, and an intensely independent identity that made them deeply suspicious of outside control. When Britain seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1806, the Boers refused to live under British rule. They packed up their families, their livestock, and their beliefs, and trekked deep into the interior of southern Africa in a movement known as the Great Trek. They established 2 independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. For decades, an uneasy peace held between the British Empire and these Boer republics. Then in 1886, everything changed. Gold was discovered in the Witwatersrand region of the Transvaal, the largest gold deposit ever found anywhere on Earth. Overnight, the Transvaal became one of the most valuable pieces of territory on the planet. Tens of thousands of foreign workers, mostly British, flooded into the region. The Boers called these newcomers Uitlanders, which means outlanders. The Transvaal government, led by the stubborn and deeply religious President Paul Kruger, refused to grant these newcomers political rights. Britain claimed it had a duty to protect its subjects. And so the stage was set. Main content: the British government, under Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain and with the backing of powerful mining interests led by Cecil Rhodes, pushed aggressively for war. A botched private military raid in 1895, known as the Jameson Raid, tried to trigger an uprising among British workers in the Transvaal. It failed spectacularly and embarrassed Britain on the world stage. But rather than stepping back, Britain doubled down. Negotiations between British High Commissioner Alfred Milner and President Kruger collapsed in 1899. Both sides were preparing for war. On October 11, 1899, the Boer Republic struck first, invading British-controlled Natal and the Cape Colony before Britain could bring reinforcements from overseas. But here is what nobody talks about. The British military establishment arrived in South Africa with a mindset shaped entirely by colonial warfare against poorly equipped opponents. They expected to crush the Boers within weeks using conventional battlefield tactics, massed infantry formations, cavalry charges, set-piece battles. What they found was something completely different. The Boers were not a conventional army. They were organized into units called commandos, loose and highly mobile groups of mounted riflemen who knew the terrain with extraordinary intimacy. Every Boer man was expected to provide his own horse and his own rifle. They used German-made Mauser rifles with exceptional accuracy at long range. They wore no uniforms, blended into the landscape, and refused to stand and fight in the open. Instead they ambushed, retreated, flanked, and vanished. The first 3 months of the war became known as Black Week for Britain. In a single devastating 7-day period in December 1899, the British Army suffered 3 catastrophic defeats in a row, at Stormberg, Margersfontein, and Colenso. At Margersfontein, Boer riflemen had dug concealed trenches at the base of a hill rather than on its summit, a tactic the British had never encountered before. When the Highland Brigade marched forward in the darkness expecting to assault an empty hillside, they walked directly into point-blank rifle fire. Over 200 soldiers died in minutes. The British public was stunned. The government rushed Field Marshal Lord Roberts and General Kitchener to South Africa as emergency reinforcements. Britain began pouring enormous resources into the conflict, eventually deploying nearly 500,000 soldiers against a Boer fighting force that never exceeded around 87,000 men. The weight of numbers eventually turned the tide. By the summer of 1900, the major Boer towns had fallen. Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal, was captured in June 1900. President Kruger fled into exile in Europe. British commanders declared the conventional war effectively over. But the war was nowhere near over. The Boer commandos refused to surrender. Under leaders like Christian de Wet, Louis Botha, and Jan Smuts, men who would later become statesmen of international stature, the Boers shifted seamlessly into guerrilla warfare. Small mobile units struck British supply lines, blew up railways, and ambushed patrols across an area the size of Western Europe. They could cover 60 miles in a single day on horseback. The British Army, built for conventional warfare, had no answer. General Kitchener implemented a brutal counterinsurgency strategy. He ordered the construction of thousands of small fortified blockhouses connected by barbed wire, dividing the landscape into zones that could be systematically swept. At the peak of the campaign, over 8,000 of these blockhouses dotted the South African countryside. Large columns of troops conducted drives across the land, pushing Boer fighters into the wire. It was methodical. It was grinding. And it was partially effective. But Kitchener also made a decision that would define Britain's historical legacy from this war in the most damaging way possible. To deny the Boer guerrillas their support network, Kitchener ordered the destruction of Boer farms. Livestock was killed, crops were burned, and farmhouses were demolished. Boer women, children, and elderly, along with large numbers of black African civilians, were rounded up and placed in camps. These were called concentration camps, and they became a catastrophe. The camps were severely overcrowded and badly supplied. Food was inadequate. Medical care was almost non-existent in the early period. Disease tore through the population. Measles, typhoid, and dysentery spread without control. The mortality rate among children in some camps exceeded 300 deaths per thousand per year. By the end of the war, approximately 28,000 Boer civilians had died in the camps, the majority of them children under the age of 16. An estimated 14,000 black Africans also died in separate and even more poorly supplied camps. Deep-dive British journalist Emily Hobhouse visited the camps in early 1901 and returned to Britain with a devastating report. Her findings caused a political storm. Liberal politician Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman stood in Parliament and called Britain's methods in South Africa methods of barbarism. A government commission led by Millicent Fawcett confirmed the essential truth of Hobhouse findings and demanded immediate improvements. Conditions in the camps did eventually improve significantly in the final year of the war. But by then, the damage, both human and reputational, was irreversible. Analysis: the Peace of Vereeniging, signed on May 31, 1902, ended the war. The Boer republics were formally annexed by Britain. But the terms were remarkably generous. Britain agreed to pay £3 million to rebuild Boer farms. The Boer leaders were guaranteed the right to keep their language and their culture. The question of voting rights for black Africans in the former republics was left entirely unresolved, a decision with consequences that would echo through South African history for nearly a century. The Boer War reshaped the British Army completely. The disasters of Black Week triggered a wholesale reform of military doctrine, training, and equipment. The army that marched into the First World War 14 years later was fundamentally different because of the lessons learned in South Africa. Marksmanship training was transformed. Tactical flexibility was emphasized. The era of the ceremonial battlefield charge was finished. But here is what nobody talks about when calculating the war's true legacy. Before you go, if you learned something valuable today, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to War History for a brand new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.